Hello, listeners. Thank you for choosing to listen to Dialogues with Creators. I don't take it for granted that you've made this choice, since there are lots of other podcasts, to say the least, that you could listen to. Thousands upon thousands. You can consider this a commercial. Actually, it's a commercial asking for commercials. I would like to keep doing this podcast, but there are expenses. So if you have a business and would like to sponsor us, please contact me through my website, barbaragrahamtucker.com. Also, we are now on YouTube if you prefer to listen that way. You can find us, but you'll need to put in the words Dialogues with Creators Podcast Barbara Tucker. There's no visual yet. It's still just audio. I'm not quite ready for the visual. Next thing, as some of you know, my 8th novel dropped on June 1st. Sudden Future is a story of grief, growth, and grace. How do you like that alliteration? Seriously, it's a human story with humor, tears, and plot twists. It's perfect for book groups, and it is available from Colorful Crow Publishing website, through me personally, and it's probably the best way, and through the usual suspects of online book dealers. Finally, please let me know if you have a guest that you think would be good for this podcast, and write us a review on whatever platform you use. Thank you for listening. We modern Americans take it for granted that somebody keeps the records. We have libraries that house books and the internet to house all kinds of information. But what about museums? Museums don't just house items and artifacts and hold on to them. They find them, restore them, make sense of them, put them in order, and explain them to us. If you think of museums as stuffy places with old pictures on the walls, and I doubt you listeners do, but some people do feel that way, hold on as we listen to a real curator describe his work and how creativity fits into it. Our guest on Dialogues with Creators today is Dr. Adam Ware of the Bandy Heritage Center, and we are going to learn a lot about the region and its history, as well as the center and its mission and work. Dr. Adam Ware is the director of the Bandy Heritage Center and BJ and Dixie Bandy Chair of American History. Welcome to our episode, Dr. Ware.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
You have a varied educational background. You earned a Bachelor of Science in Psychology, a Master's degree of Religion, and then your PhD from Florida State University is in Religious History. So how did that happen? How do all these work together for you?
It was a long way. And I think, arriving at the directorship of the Bandy Center, I feel like I kind of carved my way through the bush with a machete a little bit. But when I started, so I'm a first generation college student or college graduate, and I didn't have a lot of familial support in terms of understanding picking a major or understanding what kind of path, based on what I wanted to wind up doing. I didn't really understand the means of how to get there. And I started college thinking that I wanted to double major in international business and German, and I wanted to translate. And I took one business class and realized that that was not the path for me. And so I started looking into counseling therapy, and I was really interested in being a counselor. And I had to design an experiment for an undergraduate research methods course, and I designed it around perceiving meanings in music and popular music, and submitted it to my professor. And the program at the University of Georgia is a Bachelor's of Science in Psychology. It's not a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology. And so there's a lot of heavy weight put on cognitive research and testing and the more quantitative side of things. And so when I submitted this research proposal, their response was, we don't really do that here. This isn't really the place for that. And maybe you should look at taking a class in English literature or religion. So I picked up minors in religion and English lit. And at that time, I shifted back to an old passion of mine, which is the work of William Blake. I'm a big fan of British romantics. And one of the things that really interested me about Blake was the way he interrelates text and images, and that the meanings that you derive from his work aren't really about the text describing the images, nor are they about the images illustrating the text, but that there's something more synthetic going on there. And in the English department, they were only really interested in studying Blake in the context of his historical contemporaries. So people who were responding to the French Revolution. And I wasn't really interested in that. I was really interested in comparing Blake to other creatives of his caliber. And so comparing him to Dante or to Michelangelo. And they weren't really doing that in the English department. So I took a class on religion and literature, and going into it again, first generation college student at the time, not really familiar with the academic study of religion at all. And I'm thinking, okay, so religion and literature, that's like the Bible, right? And I get into the class and the professor begins with the sort of organizing thesis or the question for the course, which was, what are the circumstances under which the self meets the other? And I thought, I have no idea what that means. And I was hooked. And it turned out that we read some Joseph Conrad, and we read some Native American poetry, and we read A River Runs Through It. And it was a really interesting combination of stuff. And by the end of that class, I thought, I want to do religion and literature. This is a way to do the kind of literary analysis I want to do, but it's focused on habits of meaning making and memory and identity sharing and identity construction. And so I entered the master's program at UGA, and within short order, I found that my definition for literature didn't really fit what was being described at the time in religion and literature as a subfield. And so I found myself interested in performative literatures, so dance and theater. And I was interested in material literatures, so manufacturing history and the relationship of manufacturing material objects to the construction of memory, to the management of affect and emotion. So I was in all these little fields. And so I transitioned from there to religion and media culture. And then when I got to Florida State, I added on the toolkit of the historian, because up until that point, I was really a culture theorist more than anything. Mm-hmm. And at Florida State, I picked up those tools of the historian, and I really became fascinated with the intersection of media culture and material history and the production and management of collective affect and how people share feelings and how they share what we call meta affect. So how people feel about how they feel. And these are all the domains of religious behaviors. So I wasn't studying religions in the conventional sense. I was studying how people behave religiously. And you can start to see at that point that the interest in media and material culture and collective memory is a site that's ripe for inquiry when you talk about museums, because museums are institutions that manage collective memory and they deal with material culture and they participate in the creation and the sharing and dissemination of meaning. And so I started studying museums as my secondary research area was museum studies. And so I was interested in the work of museums, but I was also interested in museums as a site of study, that this was a thing we shouldn't accept as natural, the behaviors of museums, and that as we start to develop new or better ideas about how memory functions, we can apply those in museums and archives. And so I found myself in a really odd position where my intellectual colleagues weren't wanting to apply their work in museums, and my applied colleagues, my museum professional friends, weren't really interested in the theory underlying what they were doing. Mm. And so from there, I wound up in the field, and it's been a process of having built a theoretical body of work, and now we're applying it in the shaping of Northwest Georgia memory.
Wow. Okay. That is so much to take in, but it's fascinating because I think that most people who are not aware of the museum process or whatever in the museum culture would think, okay, somebody just wants to honor something an artist or a region or a phenomenon. And so we're going to have a building and have everything that has to do with them. We're going to put it up and it's going to look nice and people can come and look at it. As far as there being a theoretical foundation for it and what it is culturally for people's creation of their identity and their meaning. Yeah. And the Bandy Center is, my understanding, the first institution of its type, right? In this area.
For Northwest Georgia, it is, yes.
Yeah. I mean, there are, like, you can go down to near Calhoun and there's the place of, I think it's Etowah for the Cherokee. And then there was a building that was a museum for Fort Oglethorpe, some of the military that was there.
Right.
And then, of course, you've got the museum at the Chickamauga battlefield. And those are, well, in some cases, the government would have been behind it, I suppose. But why somebody would do that for the whole region to honor and I'm trying to think of the word, to build a sense of meaning, I guess, maybe, and a sense of what we do here is unique and it is of value. It is honorable. It's not just, hey, we make some carpets because these ladies made tufted bedspreads,
right.
or something like that, that it's that material culture comes from more than just what was available. The 41 went through and people put out, the story you always hear, they put out the tufted bedspreads, and wasn't that nice as old ladies made money off of it. That there's so much more to it. And that really all the things that we might think are kind of historical and maybe a little bit more elitist and everything, they all kind of started that way too, as material culture for survival and just this is part of who we are.
Sure.
Am I making sense?
Yeah. And I think the word you were grasping for, the word I use, you talked about, whether we honor things or whether we, celebrate things. I find that the most academically responsible word is that we interpret these things, and that's the way of assessing them without conferring a value on them, because
right.
You run into some tricky problems if your responsibility is to honor a phenomenon, and then it turns out that there are components of that phenomenon that aren't, that honoring is not really the appropriate response.
Yes.
And there are so many different kinds of sites like that. And honorifics are, Chickamauga being in our region, I think is a big part of it, that Chickamauga is America's first battlefield park or first national battlefield park. And one of the things that really interested me, and one of the scholars that I worked with was a man named Ed Linenthal at the University of Indiana. We talked frequently about how the language of religiosity starts to seep into the way Americans in particular remember historic events. And so we talk about spaces like Chickamauga Battlefield as being sacred ground. Well, what do we mean when we call these things sacred? Well, they're set apart, and they're set apart because we decided to set them apart. And so there's a lot of human decisions and human behaviors that we can chronicle. And I think to your point about the bedspreads, the thing that interests me so much about material culture and material history is that humans are finite in space and time, right? I'm here and now, and I'm not there and then, and I only have so many hours in the day. And so the things that I choose to make and share with my time reflect intimately on my values and my priorities. And so when we look at the things that a community makes and shares, we can reverse engineer those processes, and we can learn a lot about what a community values, whether it's, capital enrichment or lifting a community out of economic depression, or maybe they're decorative objects and they're about beauty and aesthetics, or maybe they're about defense, or it could be any number of things. But we can only choose to do so much. And so material history becomes a way to reflect how a community spends its time is really about its values and its priorities. And so it's a ripe way for us to to listen to people and to hear what people are saying. But at the same time, I think as critics, it's not our responsibility to take our narrators at their word. And so by looking at the material record speaks to us in a way that its creators don't necessarily. Because you may say that you're doing something for a particular reason, but what actually shows in the product may reflect a different set of priorities. And that those kinds of triangulations really fascinate me.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I like that word interpret. Thank you. Although I would wonder, though, if maybe the impetus of the people who get the idea to have a curated place, a collection, that there isn't a, like you say, with the battlefield, there is a sense of taking it to a higher level than just the cognitive or the intellectual, that they do want to honor it. They do want to call it sacred,
Sure. Yeah. And that's something that I think, we wind up, the phrase I use is we wind up being the fun police a little bit because we are a part of Dalton State College and our responsibility is to academic rigor and to the care of the collection. And so there are things that are worth celebrating. There are things that are worth honoring, but there are other things that the response might be to mourn or merely to remember. And so the word interpret leaves us an amount of space where we can do those kinds of things. But I think the only significance that we confer on the collection as the Bandy Center is not to say that this is worthy of honor or that this is worthy of condemnation, but that this is worthy of preservation and study. And that is a kind of elevation, but I think it stops short of a sanctification.
Right.
These kinds of things. And it allows us to provide that opportunity to the community, but it also allows us to provide opportunities to scholars or people who might have other goals when they look at the history of this region. Mm-hmm.
Well, going back to your background, we kind of took a detour there, but that was a very interesting detour. Your dissertation was titled, now you've already been in psych, in religious history, media studies, and I said religion and history. And one thing about getting your PhD in history, was that a stretch because your other degrees were not in history?
Well, no, my degree is actually in religion, but the specialty is American religious history.
Oh, I see. So, okay. So that
my two specialty, the degree, what's written on the paper is religion, but the specialties were American religious history with emphasis in museum studies.
Ah, okay. Anyway, back to your dissertation. It was titled Dreaming of a Hillbilly Heaven, Religion, Emotion, and American Country Music, 1925 to 1954. Now, first thing I want to say is that is a great title for a dissertation. My dissertation title has no poetry whatsoever in it, but it was more in the social sciences. So you must have an interest in music as well.
Yes. I grew up in a musical house, and we used to joke in the religion department that the same way that I was talking about material history and you can learn about somebody's values based on what they make, the field of religious studies it's a very elective field, and nobody just winds up in it the way you might wind up in, a college of any size is likely to have an English department or a history department or a chemistry department, and they may not necessarily have a religion department. And so to wind up in that department takes a different level of effort, not a better level of effort, but you don't just wind up there. And so we used to joke that you could learn a lot about somebody in the field based on what they chose to study. And so the fact that I grew up in a musical house, my grandparents were in gospel groups, and I was as an adolescent, adolescence is all about rebellion, and my parents both had very great taste in music, and so it was a very hard place to rebel when your parents already have good taste in music. So my dad raised me on the Grateful Dead and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and my mother raised me on Diana Ross and Smokey Robinson. So I grew up in a house that was, when we talk about, one of the definitions I used to use when I would teach was that religion is about how you reveal to yourself what your ultimate concern is. And in our family, it was clear that music was a way of accessing those greatest priorities. But as I started trying to put together a dissertation, I had written a lot about new media technologies. One of the things that always interested me in communications media is whenever there's a new media technology developed, it always is first and foremost put to a conventionally religious purpose. And that always fascinated me about why that is and what that has to do with the Protestant temperament and things like that. So, the movable type printing press is invented to create the Bible. The first book printed in the New World is the Massachusetts Bay Book of Psalms. The first message transmitted across the transatlantic telegraph cable is "Look at what God hath wrought." Yeah. The first woman granted a broadcasting license by the FCC was a Pentecostal minister, and on and on. And so I had written all these things about much earlier forms of media, but I was also really interested in performance of gender and performances of queerness in 70s rock and roll. So I'd written a lot about David Bowie and people like that. But as I was talking with my dissertation director, neither of those seemed like a place where I really wanted to dive in. And his response was, "Well, have you thought about writing about folk music during the Depression?" And I had not. And so as I started diving in, what I found, and this turned out to be the content of the dissertation, was the dissertation tracks the role of Appalachian Protestant affective norms, so attitudes toward performing emotion and interpreting emotion, and how those Appalachian Protestant affective norms contributed to the commercial development of the country music recording industry. And so how is it that, for instance, when people are defending when country music, or what was known at that time hillbilly music, first started, the concerns about it were about emotional intemperance. So people would say, "Oh, this bluegrass music, it's rambunctious, it's cantankerous, it makes me feel inappropriate things." And George Hay, who was the leader of the Grand Ole Opry, what was known at the time as the WSM Barn Dance, defended it by saying it might be a riot, but it's a good-natured riot. And the thing that fascinated me was he didn't have to explain what he meant when he said it was good-natured. And the more I thought about that, the less sense it made. Like, what does it mean to be good-natured? What does it mean to be wholesome? And so these emotional complexes of wholesomeness and good-naturedness, they made a lot of people a lot of money in the country music recording industry. And so how do you commercialize affect? How do you commercialize a feeling? And that really fascinated me, that what emerged through the Depression was what I called an affective industrial complex, that performing a certain feeling became tremendously popular in the Depression. And of course, the musicians out of Appalachia are singing from historically depressed places. Mm-hmm. And then when the Depression hits, people in places like New York and Boston and Chicago, suddenly they're experiencing economic depression. And what the country music industry did was they were able to mate economic depression to spiritual depression. And they were able to solve your spiritual depression. And by buying records, you solved their economic depression. And, that it really fascinated me that what you started to see was a kind of better felt than said popular theology. So when the Carter family records "There's no depression in heaven," what they're saying to you, the most important thing you need to know about heaven in this case is not that there's streets paved with gold, and not that you'll see your grandma again, not that you'll be on a cloud playing a lyre, but that heaven is a place where you won't be depressed anymore. And I thought that was really profound. And the story begins with the development of the Opry and the commercial standardization of the 78 RPM record. Well, when you standardize that playback format, the cost drops and more people can make records. Well, who starts making records? Ministers start making records. And you start seeing these really weird material artifacts where there's an ad in a Chicago newspaper that advertises audio recordings of natural body baptisms. So like river baptisms. And for the life of me, I couldn't understand what the appeal would be of listening to someone get baptized in a river, right? That's a very bodily experience. I don't understand what you get from listening to it. And in the advertisement, it says, "Feel better by having this record in your home." So there's a material affective component that having this record is going to change your feelings. But then by the end of my periodization for my diss, it ended with Hank Williams being fired from the Grand Ole Opry, and then later with the record signings of Elvis Presley and Johnny Cash. But by the time that Hank Williams was fired from the Opry, you start to see this affective industrial system has been codified so that when he gets fired for industrial reasons and affective reasons, right? At heart, he gets fired because he's a drunk. Well, the problem with him being a drunk is that he's not meeting his contractual obligations, which is an industrial problem. And people don't want to hear him on the radio, which is an affective problem. Mm-hmm. And so this thing that seems so ephemeral or nebulous starts to have real effects on the industry and real effects on people's careers and lives. And then the final step in that process was studying how that era was interpreted at the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum in Nashville. Oh. So you start to see all these weird little dog whistles. So the motto of the way you might study white privilege or male privilege, a lot of what I was studying was Protestant privilege. So what are the things that Protestants don't have to explain by virtue of being a predominant culture? So the Country Music Hall of Fame's motto is honor thy music, which is a phrase that really makes a little more sense if you're familiar with biblical tradition. Mm-hmm. During the time that I was going up there to do research, they were doing a capital campaign to expand the building, and they were playing music from speakers out over the pavilion in front of the building. And they were playing an old gospel song called Working on a Building. And the point was that they are working on their building and you could donate money. But the lyrics of that song are, I'm working on a building. It's a Holy Ghost building. And I was really fascinated that country music is ostensibly secular. It's ostensibly capitalist. And yet they don't have to explain the relationship of this gospel song to what they're doing. And it's just all over the Hall of Fame that it all just makes a little more sense if you already bring to it a certain participation in a religious culture of feeling. Mm-hmm. So that was, and that's the long and the short of how I wound up there.
Well, I'm a little older than you, and I grew up with my mother playing Hank Williams and not knowing the story behind him, as far as how he died and everything, which was so sad. But listening to, watching Hee Haw, that was,
oh yeah,
in the early 60s, and growing up on that stuff. And we always would laugh about how there always be a gospel song at the end of Hee Haw. Which I think shows you it's assumed it's assumed that Elvis is going to have a gospel album. It was even assumed before Johnny Cash really became more converted, because than he originally was, that he was going to sing because of his wife and other things, even though in his personal life, he was not exactly a choir boy, you might say, some of the things he did, or Elvis. But we would laugh because Hee Haw would show, they'd have these girls in tight little short shorts, just hanging around looking sexy. And at the end, they'd have gospel song.
They bring it back. They bring it back home. Yeah.
Yeah. They bring it back home, So that's sort of a superficial version of what you're talking about, I think, that, or if you've ever been to the Opry to there's always going to be a gospel portion of that along with the honky tonk, so it's sort of, we know these things exist. We know there's the drinking and all that stuff and the womanizing, but we're going to come back to the Bible here and get it right.
And that's one of the things that George Hay would say to defend the Opry was, he was famous for saying, these people have feelings on Saturday night, but they have feelings on Sunday morning too. And he didn't have to explain that. But, your point about Johnny Cash marrying June Carter, one of the strangest things I came across in that research was the life and career of a guy named John Romulus Brinkley. And John Romulus Brinkley was a doctor in Kansas who had run for governor of Kansas. He was an early adopter of radio technology, and he would advertise his medical services on his own radio station. Well, his surgery, he was a quack. There's actually a really great book about it called Charlatan. And his surgeries were male impotence therapies. And
yes, I've heard of this guy. Yes.
Well, after he was removed from Kansas, he set up a radio station in Del Rio, Texas, and his radio tower was just across the river in Villa Acuna, Mexico. Well, because it's across the river, it's out of the FCC's jurisdiction. And so at a time when the wattage limit was 50,000 watts, he was running a 500,000 watt radio transmitter out of Mexico and was broadcasting around the clock. And there were reports of people picking it up in their dental fillings and picking it up in metal fence posts. But he would couch this therapy in religious language. So he would say that he would give you a resurrection like unto Lazarus. And to make himself, this kind of goes back to the commodification of wholesomeness, to give himself this veneer of wholesomeness, he hired the Carter family at a time when AP was divorcing from Sarah. And there's a really great interview with June Carter where she says, they went down there and performed in the winter when they weren't touring. And when she first met John Brinkley, that he was wearing a white linen Panama suit and had a monkey on his shoulder. So I can just imagine the weirdness. But his whole point was just by having the Carters play, it absolved him of any kind of moral, impropriety. I think that's profound.
Yeah. The music covers it all. Mm-hmm. So that makes the honor the music make sense.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fascinating. So anyway, the title "Dreaming of a Hillbilly Heaven," boy, that's a great title for a dissertation. So I'm fascinated with all these threads, and you worked in curating collections before you came back to Dalton, though, right? And we'll talk about Dalton in a minute. Yeah.
So while I was finishing my dissertation, I accepted a position at the Orange County Regional History Center, which is a Smithsonian affiliate in Orlando.
Oh, okay.
And there I was a historian and research librarian over the Joseph L. Breckner Research Center, which is at the Orange County Regional History Center. And when I accepted that position, I've kind of fallen backwards through my career. And so when I accepted that position, I thought, okay, Central Florida history, like Disney World, right? Like,
oh, don't say that to the locals. My goodness.
And now, the world has changed 100 times over since then. But what really fascinated me was, Disney had already shown up a lot in my work when we talk about tourism as pilgrimage, and it's not exactly holy, but it might be sacred to a lot of people. And so I got down there, and what really fascinated me was the History Center collects 7 counties. And so we collected Disney, what was known at the time as the Florida Project, when Walt Disney was first getting started. But we also collected Daytona International Speedway. We collected the Space Coast at Cape Canaveral, the Plant City Strawberry Festival. And then, of course, the big kid in the middle of the room was the Florida citrus industry. Mm-hmm. And working to grow those collections and working with communities that historically had not seen themselves represented in archives, I used to joke that if you ever met a second generation Orlandoan, you should put them in a museum, because nobody's from Orlando. Everybody goes to Orlando. And as I would talk to some of the older generations, they always brought up a statistic that I thought was really compelling, which was that in 1970, the year before the Magic Kingdom opened, Orlando had 50,000 people. And now it has 4.9 million or so. So a lot of their history is recent history. But their point about the 50,000 people was that they would say this was a small town and we're number one in the world for this strange product that nobody else makes, which was oranges, tangelos, grapefruits, what have you. And the more I thought about that, I had a natural affinity, because I grew up in a small town that was number one in the world for a weird product that nobody else made.
Yeah.
And so kind of the whole time I was down there, I kept thinking, it was a really well-run operation. And I kept thinking, I wish someone would do the kind of memory management work for Northwest Georgia that we're doing here. My partner got one of her degrees is from Georgia State, and she got an email on the listserv one night. We were sitting at her apartment. She was the curator of exhibits at the museum. And so I was the farmer and she was the chef. Mm-hmm. And she said, I think Dalton's hiring a museum director. And I said, well, there's a lot of history in Dalton, but I don't think anybody's hiring a museum director. And she said, Dalton State College? And I said, yeah, that's where my parents met in 1973. And she said, the Bandy Heritage Center? And at that point, she had me. And my wife is not from here. But I immediately turned my head and I said, like Jack Bandy. And coming up for the interview was a really fun experience because it was something going into that field I never thought I'd come home again. So for the past 5 years, we've been building a record of community life, that hadn't really existed before.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting story. And yeah, I bet working in Orlando would have been fascinating. Again, I'm old enough to remember watching the Walt Disney show on Sunday nights back in the 60s and him talking about what they were going to do in Florida, and of course we wouldn't have, as a child, I wouldn't have understood the scope of it. And I went there the first time in 1974. So I went early before it was really done, I think. And I didn't go back until for like 30 years. I didn't go back. It's hot. I'm not a Florida person.
Yeah.
If it's my vacation, I'm going north. I'm going someplace cold. So, yeah, my son's only been to Disney World once. And he was 12 at the time, so it really wasn't a thing. Yeah, but I've talked to people who were from Florida, and they say pre-Disney, and they're very, very like proud of it. And
our exhibit at the museum about Disney was actually called "The Day We Changed."
Oh wow!
Yeah.
So you're a graduate of Dalton High.
Yes, I am. Class of 2000.
Oh, okay. So you've kind of alluded to this, but how does being a local connect with your work at the Heritage Center?
On a certain level, it shouldn't. And there's a theoretical level and a practical level, but you shouldn't have to be local to study local history. The analogy that I always use is that you shouldn't have to be a bug to study entomology, because it's not a way to develop any kind of body of knowledge that is transmissible, that is communicable to other people. If it's purely insider knowledge for insider's sake. That said, I think Northwest Georgia communities are distinctive in a certain way that when you're creating an archives, now running an archives might be a different story, but I think when you're trying to explain to a community how this works to kind of turn a mirror back on this community and its values, it definitely helps to have an informal memory of the place and to have some basic command of names and family names and events and things like that. And so categorically it shouldn't help, but it absolutely does. And I think there are doors that open because I'm local and local with deep roots. I didn't really get into genealogy until I got into this field. And so I didn't know until I got to Orlando, actually, you can only help other people with their genealogy so much before you get the bug. You want to do your own. And come to find out that my family's been in Northwest Georgia for 6 generations. And that even in a place with, where things change as slowly as they do here, there aren't a ton of 6th generation natives around, and my family's been outside of Ringgold since about 1828. And so I do this work as an academic and as a professional, but I also have a personal stake in seeing these stories preserved. And the way we respect the people of the past is by respecting the complexity of their world. And so it's an opportunity to do a service even as I'm doing my job.
Mm-hmm. And I'm gonna read the mission of the Bandy Center here, and before I say that, I want to say that my roots are Appalachian and Virginia, and the thing that I think that people tend to look at a region they don't know and see it as being very homogeneous, and don't realize that's not correct.
Right.
And that kind of comes through in your mission, which is to collect, preserve, and interpret the material and cultural histories of Northwest Georgia's many communities. Mm-hmm. And I like that because there are many communities. There's obviously we think of the people who have been here for a long time, who maybe are the more elite types, the names we recognize. There would be those who are maybe have more in the religious community. Maybe it's those who are in the industrial and those who are in the immigrant community.
Sure.
And then, of course, there's going to be sub-communities of those who are into maybe music or something else. So I like that. And then the vision is through archival collection, artifact preservation, museum exhibitions, scholarly research, and heritage programming. The Bandy Heritage Center for Northwest Georgia strives to ignite curiosity about the past, spark conversation in the present, and inspire the leaders of the future, all while articulating a compelling vision for community identity and memory. Did you write that?
I did.
Okay.
I wrote them both. I think a lot in terms of, and this comes back from a background in teaching religion, but I always think in terms of awkward consequences when we establish definitions. That if we're gonna define a category or a phenomenon, we have to use language that is going to account for the most awkward consequences within a field, the most odd typologies. And so if the original mission for the Bandy Heritage Center was celebrating the history of Northwest Georgia, which sounds awesome. Who doesn't want to celebrate the history of Northwest Georgia? But there's a lot in human history, and certainly in Northwest Georgia history, where celebration is not the appropriate response. But if our mission is celebrating, then it means we are falling afoul of our mission to do anything other than celebrate. Mm-hmm. How do you celebrate slavery? Mm-hmm. How do you celebrate sexism? How do you celebrate exploitation of labor? There's all these other things. And I just don't know that that's the right way. And so in writing that mission and that vision, how can we create a mission that is going to allow us to go into any corner or to lift any stone?
Yeah.
And that was kind of the goal, was that this is for Northwest Georgia. And so you don't want any Northwest Georgian to feel like this is not their heritage center.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see where the word celebration could be problematic for what you're doing. So can you bring that down to what somebody is going to find there?
Sure.
If they go, let me say, as you know, I bring my first year students there just on a little tour I do of the campus, is sort of the places you don't know about. Right. And I want them to know that if they're interested in history, there's a place they can come, or they could do an internship or something. And I don't know, it's more of a secondary thing. It's not so much that I expect them to do that as they need to know that Dalton State is more than just a parking lot and some buildings, where they go and get some credits. Mm-hmm. And, because, a lot of the freshmen are like, I'm going to transfer, which they don't. But, I want them to see this is a lot more than what you think it is as a place. Yeah.
And the Bandy Center is a great connection point for the community that way. I describe the Bandy Center as having 1 foot on campus and 1 foot in the community. Mm-hmm. And anybody who's familiar with the geography and the topography of Dalton in particular, Dalton State is on the west side of the interstate. And so there's an informal, since 1963, there's been this kind of informal mentality in town that Dalton is over here and Dalton College is over there. Oh. And the interstate is this kind of dividing line. And so what I love about the Bandy Center is that it gives the college and any faculty that want to draw on our resources and the administration, it gives us an opportunity to reach the community in a way that, I think a lot of times we think about, okay, well, how do we interact with the community? Well, if they enroll in our classes, then they're a student. But there are a lot of ways that this college serves its community beyond just enrollment or beyond just classroom instruction. And so this is really an interesting beachhead for that. But when people come to the center, our main offices are here on the first floor of the Darrell Roberts Library here at Dalton State. And to draw down that mission and that vision into practical terms, so we collect material history, and that falls for us into 4 main categories of material that you'll find in the archives. The first of those is audiovisual material, so photographs, slides, negatives, LPs, which, tying back to my dissertation research, Northwest Georgia has a long gospel recording history, and so we collect records from small churches that had a little gospel quartet that recorded an album in the 60s. So, slides, negatives, photos, audio, VHS cassettes, that all falls under audiovisual media. The second category is documents and paper records. And that's a very broad category, almost too broad to put your arms around without putting it in concrete terms. But that includes everything from real estate records and deeds and plat maps to high school yearbooks to cookbooks, letters and correspondence, business records, civic and organizational records. It varies widely. Maps and atlases, I may have mentioned. And those first two categories are by and large of high research value. But the third category, artifacts and objects, is typically we collect for its high exhibition value. So artifacts and objects are typically what you would expect to see in a museum. You know, when people come in to see the archives, I think they expect it to look like, you know, there was an era in DC Comics when Batman kept souvenirs from his villains in the Batcave. So you'd see like, you know, something from the Joker or something from Two-Face. And I think people expect that when they come into the archives and it's all boxes of paper. Right? I think it's a little underwhelming. But the artifacts are just as broad of a category, including everything from tools and equipment from the carpet industry, military and school uniforms, athletic equipment, Letterman jackets, to a much lesser degree, Cherokee and indigenous material. And part of the reason for that is there's a federal statute called NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. So we don't focus to a great extent on Cherokee history, because if we want to interpret Cherokee history, we'll do that in collaboration with the Cherokee Nation. Mm-hmm. And then the fourth category would be oral histories. So we transcribe oral histories. And so when you to the question, what would you expect to find when you come here? We have a reading room for research access to use the collection. We have a preservation lab for cleaning, organizing, housing, describing, managing the material itself. And because we are a part of Dalton State, that lab is also a teaching lab. The work here is historical work, but I think the practices aren't necessarily the practices of a historian. And so it's important for students to know that if you have a photograph, say, of Dalton College, well, knowing the history of Dalton College is one field of knowledge, but knowing how to preserve the emulsion on that photograph is a different field of knowledge. And so we kind of do both at the same time here. We have a small hallway gallery where we can turn around exhibits, just new things into the collection, and then we have archival storage, and we are Northwest Georgia's only cold storage. So I think one of the things that makes a difference for us vis-a-vis other historical efforts in the region is our ability to apply the science of preservation and to account for the longevity and the security of the material.
Yeah. And considering all the things you get, is everything that the Heritage Center owns in that building, or is there another?
No, we do. Right now we have 3 sites, and we're kind of built, knowing that Dalton State is tucked up against Rocky Face Ridge. There's not a whole lot of opportunity for major construction projects. Right. And so we have a three facility model. So what's here on campus is mainly for research and preservation. We also have exhibition space downtown in Dalton's historic 1911 freight depot, where right now we have a display of chenille bedspreads, which is, I describe it as Dalton 101. So it's a great way for people who are unfamiliar with Dalton to see some of that chenille history. And then we also have offsite storage, because some of the, especially when it comes to artifacts, most of what we store on campus are photos and documents and our research library. But there are some artifacts that are quite large. Some carpet manufacturing equipment or certain automobiles of historic significance. We want to have a place, if those get offered to us, we want to have a place for those to land.
Right. When you mentioned that, I thought, okay, I know they don't have carpet industry machines in that building at the library. So, okay. And this is in the vicinity of Dalton, but it's cold storage.
Right. Well, what the cold storage is actually here on campus.
Okay.
The other storage is climate controlled. Artifacts tend to fare a lot better under typical residential conditions. So 70 degrees, 50% humidity.
Okay.
But a lot of what we have here, especially photographic negatives and some of those more fragile materials, need a much colder, drier environment to last.
Okay. So on a daily basis, what do you do? What is it you really do, Adam?
Sure.
I mean, you go in in the morning with your coffee, and what do you do?
So at this point, one of the jokes that we shared right as the pandemic hit was right around the time we moved into this facility. So the facility here on campus is new since 2018. And one of the jokes that we shared was we knew we had become a real archive once we had backlog. And that, I think in the immediate sense on a day-to-day basis, a lot of what we do is processing collections that have come in. So that involves assessing what a donor has offered to see if it's something we need, if it tells a story that we haven't been able to tell before, if it's something that we're capable of caring for. And then once we determine that something is appropriate for the collection, we begin a process that is called accessioning. And that involves the cataloging, the photographing, the description, the assessment, the housing. So, making sure that a particular item is stored appropriately so that it doesn't damage itself or damage other parts of the collection, and making sure that it's cataloged so that researchers can find it. And so in the immediate sense, that's a lot of what goes on here day to day. But for me in particular, part of my curatorial responsibility for the collection is going out and meeting with community members whose stories haven't been told. And one of the challenges for Northwest Georgia history is that in the absence of the Bandy Center, I talk a lot about material reality, that there are objects that are out there that are of significance and they have to exist somewhere. That's their material reality. So are they in a shoebox? Are they under somebody's bed? Are they in a barn? And so, a lot of it, some people say that being a historian is like being a detective, right? You follow the breadcrumb trail, and it's partly that, but then the preservation impulse means that I'm a little bit more like an insurance adjuster. So I'm thinking, what if it rains? What if it floods? What if it burns? But I think a lot of the my work here at the center is really acquainting people with what we do and getting them to see their place in our work, because it's not a question of, well, to put it another way, if you live in Northwest Georgia, if you exist in Northwest Georgia, you're already a part of Northwest Georgia history. So it's not a question of whether your story belongs. It's a question of where your story belongs. That's a profound cognitive change when people realize that this is not a hall of fame. So you don't have to be rich. You don't have to be famous. You don't have to be well connected. And in fact, pursuing the rich, the famous, and well-connected is not an especially great way to do history. Like when you talk about the carpet industry, for instance, there are a lot of leaders in the industry who've done incredible things, but one thing they haven't done is literally made carpet. And so when you want to talk to the guys who work in the mills, when you want to talk to people who've worked in the industry, you don't necessarily want a top-down model for that. When we want to study school history, well, we want to talk to students and we want to talk to alumni. And so there's a lot of human relations and a lot of sort of storytelling and active listening so that people will realize that the things that they value are the things that their community values. And there's a connection between what we do and what somebody might value in their scrapbook or their grandmother's recipe box or whatever it might be. And ensuring that we can preserve those things for the good of the community.
Well, the name of this is Dialogues with Creators. And our thesis is that creativity is not just the arts. It's not just found in one area of life. So how would you say that creativity comes into play with what is done at the center?
I think creativity is, especially with the center being as young as it is, but I don't think it would be any less true years from now. I think creativity is everywhere in what we do. And I think acknowledging creativity in the building of a historical record is a vital step toward avoiding the naturalization of blind spots in our interpretive vision, because I think that there is one of the things I used to train my students on is that we have to defamiliarize the given. The things we think are given, we can't accept them as such. And that's especially true when you talk about local history and public history, that I think when people learn about the Bandy Center, I think that people think of it as a natural deposit for old and historic stuff. That like if you were to shake the city of Dalton like a mining pan, that all of the historical stuff would just sort of settle down into the Bandy Center. And that's not true. It's not true of archives in general. And that's part of my scholarly perspective as much as it is my professional perspective, that archives are artifacts too. We collect artifacts, but the archives itself is an artifact. And just like a bicycle or a carpet machine or whatever it might be, this archives is created through human effort, and it's sustained through human effort, and it reflects the priorities of its creator. And that is something that we have to acknowledge and kind of keep in front of us, so that I don't mistake what I think of as historic for what might be necessary for historical inquiry in the future. And so there's a measure of creativity that goes into distinguishing the past, which is the bucket of stuff that's happened over time, versus history, which history is a story I create to interpret things that happened in the past. And I think there's a sleight of hand where those two things get conflated, where I think people think history is the past or it's the study of the past. And that's not really true. History is the study of change over time. And when we keep that in a denaturalized position, it requires creativity on our part to think creatively about what is historically significant about this community or this community or this community, and how do these things fit together. And that's true for building the collection, and it's true for interpreting the collection too. One of the examples that I love to give, and this kind of falls to the level of almost cocktail party conversation, but if I were to tell you a story about military history, well, one part of that story at some point down the line would be the MRE, the meal ready to eat, right? Well, if I tell you a story about food history, at some point down the line, the MRE would show up again. But the role of an MRE in military history and the role of an MRE in the history of food is a different role. And as we think about where these things fit, there's never a time where we put a period on the end of the sentence and we say, this is what this means. This is what this is. And to keep that flexibility in mind and to know that interpretation is never a done deal, I think is necessarily a creative project. We are creating a record of community memory.
Right. Neat. I'm reminded of the work I've read on creativity, that there is divergent creativity and there's convergent creativity, being that divergent means the creation of diverse ideas, things, just we might call it brainstorming, coming up with ideas, seeing things that haven't been seen before, and that tends to be the idea of creation. But there's this other side called the convergent, where it is the discrimination part, if I can use that word. It is the discerning part. It's, right. And it's the decision, okay, this has been created, but is this really original? Is this really effective? Does this really work artistically or something like that? I write fiction and I can come up with all kinds of crazy stuff, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be readable. And so that divergent part where I tell my story in all of its detail and then I come back in the convergent part. And so I kind of connect it to that, that you've got to have both sides of it. So we're coming to the end here, and I always like to ask people what they're reading. What are you reading now?
So
to read.
One of my favorites, I'm actually rereading one of my favorite books from grad school, and it kind of goes to your point about creativity too. So one of my favorite scholars for studying the relationship of affect and memory, which is to say that's how I express studies of things like trauma and nostalgia, that these are intersections of feeling and memory. One of my favorite scholars in that field is a guy named Alan Trachtenberg, and he released a book several years ago called Shades of Hiawatha, Staging Indians and Making Americans. And what really fascinated me about his work is the exposure of how the identity of Native Americanness, if you will, or indigenous Americanness, has been deployed as a trope in a kind of calculated way to serve at all times, to serve the benefit of people who are deploying it, to serve power groups. And so he compares and contrasts the kind of shifting of feet where, as America is shifting westward or moving westward, we're on a footing where we perceive of indigenous Americans as fundamentally hostile, that these people are savages and we have to take this land from them. And then as we take this land from them, there is a softening and a nostalgia. There's an affective massaging of memory, where we shift from saying that these are the noble forebears and that we have inherited this land from these people. And in particular, he explores that through American creative media. And so one of the examples he draws heavily on is Disney's Song of Hiawatha. And that whatever, on one hand, American media culture has a way of depicting Native Americans as bloodthirsty savages. And on the other hand, we depict them as these kind of obsessively gentle, ecological, progressive. The truth is both and more complicated than. But the point is that at any one point, we're only showing whatever side of the picture benefits us the most. The problem with that is that you take those media depictions and then you add in time as an ingredient, and those media depictions take on a veneer of historical authority so that we accept these things as fact and they become naturalized. One of the examples I used frequently as a media critic was he talks a lot about the photography of Edward Sheriff Curtis, who was famous for his photographic depictions of Native Americans. And Curtis's own history, as Trachtenberg points out, I think is really telling, because he starts out basically giving his subscribers what they pay for. So his subscribers include Teddy Roosevelt and J.P. Morgan and all these industrialists. And what they want is a reclamation project. So he goes out and photographs Native Americans basically to say, look, we didn't kill them all, which is horrifying and colonial to think that that's what that's about. And
that reminds me of we were out west and we went to the Crazy Horse exhibit near Mount Rushmore. I always forget the name of the place. And, if you know anything about that place, it's just a total, I'm sorry, it's just really a cash grab, because they have this nice little museum there and you pay to get in, and then you have to pay to get closer to the sculpture, which is not even remotely done. And you can see it as well. You can see it as well from the road as you can from being in the place. And I was so annoyed. I was so annoyed by the whole thing because of the money we spent. But that falls right into, somebody trying to make money off of this depiction of Native Americans in that museum. All the pictures are of a certain type, and that's a fascinating. I'll have to remember that, and since I have a transcript of this, I'll be able to find the book. Well, I want to thank you.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say there's a relationship, I think, that's of value for creators to consider, which is that erasure is by definition an act of creation too. And I think that's what Curtis was doing is, he takes a photo of a Native American and he's trying to project this kind of pristine, nostalgic quality. Well, in some cases, for instance, he takes a picture of a person in their home and they have a mantle clock. And so he removes the mantle clock so that he can get a more authentic picture. And the irony is that he's creating a model of authenticity that is ironically not authentic at all.
Right.
And that interplay, I think, is something that you can get to through material in a way that you can't get to necessarily through speaking to somebody. But yeah, that's
and I imagine that you could probably follow that thesis through all kinds of things.
Oh, yeah.
As it comes to me. Well, I want to thank you for being with us today. It was fascinating. And any of you who are listening, I recommend that you visit the Bandy Heritage Center, that you go to their website, and that you find out more about it, because you will be very glad that you did. And this is an area that the campus and this community and the whole region needs to know a whole lot more about. So thank you for being with us today, Dr. Ware.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.